Thank you, choir, and Fred, and Vic. Always glad to have you with us. Last summer, I explored one day the Stanford campus. And while I was there, I wandered into the big campus bookstore. I'm always interested in the history of any place that is new to me. And among the many books about Stanford University that were on display, I found one that was written in 2022 by Richard White. White is an emeritus history professor at Stanford, and the provocative title of his book is Who Killed Jane Stanford? I also love true crime mysteries, so I just had to buy it. Before I read it, I knew absolutely nothing about Jane Stanford or that she had been killed, and I knew only a little bit about her husband, Leland. Other than he was a super wealthy robber baron, railroad tycoon, and politician, and that he founded and named a college after his only child, Leland Jr., who had died at the age of 15 from typhoid. Now, if you have not read Who Killed Jane Stanford, it provides a really nice overview of how the university got started and a very colorful picture of life on the San Francisco Peninsula during the Gilded Age and beyond, the 1870s roughly through the early 20th century. Beyond that, it's a pretty decent crime whodunit. Now, I don't want to ruin anyone's reading experience, but Jane was poisoned. However, I'm not going to tell you who did it. And I assume that it's all very accurate. After all, Richard White specialized in that era of American history at Stanford. So we would think he'd be pretty invested in getting his story right. But to set up this story, to understand why anyone in the world would ever even want to kill Jane Stanford in the first place, White goes into great detail about her, what she was like as a person, who she associated with, and what she left behind in her correspondence, which actually was quite a bit, and what she is known to have done. Turns out, Jane Stanford was a dyed-in-the-wool spiritualist. And at that time, she was far from being alone in her beliefs. Now, many people, especially conservative or fundamentalist Christians, thought spiritualism was blasphemy. Many others thought it was simply silly or a way for skilled hustlers and frauds to swindle innocent people out of their hard-earned money. Spiritualism is the belief that living people can communicate with the dead, sometimes directly, but usually it's through a medium. And a medium, well, that's somebody who is tuned in to the spirit world and they act as a conduit for the living to talk to or in some way communicate with dead people, usually their loved ones. Spiritualism claims that in the spirit world, a person's spirit continues to grow and evolve, and those spirits can offer insight on moral and ethical issues, and they can even help the living understand the true nature of things, including the nature of God. It was a fairly large movement in the English-speaking world between roughly 1840 and 1920. And it had a lot of prominent followers who wrote very widely about it and how it dovetailed nicely with Christianity, they thought. In fact, many, if not most, spiritualists considered themselves to be Christians of one stripe or another. Now, some historians point out that the popularity of spiritualism coincided with the rise of mechanized warfare and the appalling loss of life that those wars produced. During and after the American Civil War, spiritualism gained a lot of followers, especially among women who had lost husbands and sons on far-flung battlefields. If you ever visit an old cemetery where people of that era are buried, and you know what to look for, you'll see evidence of spiritualist beliefs etched on the grave markers and monuments. Jane Stanford was a product of her time, and the loss of her son, Leland Jr., was a huge blow for her. The decision to found a college in his memory was one way to work through that personal tragedy, and one building on the Stanford campus in particular sums up Jane's beliefs that she could communicate with Leland Jr. beyond his death and with her husband, Leland Sr., who died in 1893. Anyone want to guess what building that is? The Stanford Memorial Church, dedicated by Jane in 1903 as a memorial to her late husband. That can be also understood as a monument to spiritualism. Jane famously said, "While my whole heart is in the university, my soul is in that church." Ostensibly, the church is non-denominational with plenty of Judeo-Christian influences, but if you know where to look in the design, in the artwork, in the stained glass, and in the words that are carved onto the walls, the ideals of spiritualism are all over the place. By the time that Jane Stanford died in 1905, spiritualism was also beginning to die out as a popular movement. It was only seen by many people as a sham that was sometimes used by con artists to prey on grieving people. It was, like a lot of spiritual beliefs, being called into question, up against the march of science and technology, things that you could prove, you could put to the test in the lab, or you could disprove. Much of what we assume today really about religious beliefs or experiences derives from that time frame, including the whole notion that religion and spirituality are incompatible with rational science-based thinking, that the two can never be reconciled. Most folks don't realize that Christian fundamentalism, as we know it today, is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it rose up in popularity during that very same time period because fundamentalism was a reaction to scientific breakthroughs like the work of Charles Darwin on evolution and the discoveries that were being made in fields like paleontology and geology. So fundamentalism was a doubling down on religion. Fundamentalists sought, and they still seek, to place their religious beliefs as distinct from and superior to science. And those dedicated to a rational scientific worldview are only too happy to distance themselves from fundamentalism. We see this playing out in unfortunate ways as those who profess an evangelical fundamentalist faith often have the loudest voices in the public square, it seems. So they have increasingly been perceived by the general public as representing all of Christianity rather than just a fraction of it. That is why so many people, and especially those of my children's generation, for example, assume that being a Christian automatically means you're discriminatory toward LGBTQ people and that you want to eliminate women's reproductive rights and ban certain books from libraries, and that you think it's a good idea to have the Ten Commandments placed in every classroom. It's not very well understood that one can be a Christian, to follow the teachings and the example of Jesus, and believe that loving kindness is stronger than anything, without also being a narrow-minded, misogynistic, intolerant homophobe. That can be a surprise to many that we actually believe in science and tolerance, that we believe in loving and treating our neighbors as we wish to be treated. And that means sometimes for those of us who hold both spiritual worldviews and scientific worldviews, the space we occupy can feel kind of lonely. Have any of you felt like that lately? Or it might seem sometimes as if we're asked to put one way of thinking about the universe on hold whenever we focus on the other. Sort of like having a closet in your house to hide things in when certain people come over to visit. You might think, I can't let my friend who's a physicist see that I have a Bible on my bookshelf. I think I'm a nut. But I don't think that is ever necessary. Then, of course, I'm a minister, so I suppose I'm expected to expertly navigate the space between the rational, scientific world and the spiritual world. Truth is, I think the notion that many folks have that spirituality and science are irreconcilable is a false premise to begin with. I don't know if the spiritualism that Jane Stanford believed in is true or not. Probably cannot be proven scientifically, but I'm not sure anyone who believes in it really cares if it's proven scientifically. As long as no one gets hurt by holding a belief, and if they're not imposing their beliefs on others, why do I care what they believe? Spiritualism itself is a cousin of a much larger and long-standing family of spiritual beliefs that are generally called mysticism. Almost every established faith we know of has a mystical tradition, including Christianity. Back in 1902, the psychologist and philosopher William James published a best-selling book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. It was a big hit, and it was required reading back when I was in seminary. It introduced the general public to the idea that people can have a whole range of mystical experiences that simply cannot be explained. So that means one person sitting in a pew at a religious meeting or church service, they might have a transcendent or ecstatic conversion experience where they believe that they're communing with the holy in an intimate way. Meanwhile, the person sitting right next to them might be bored out of their skull and thinking deeply about baseball. But the thing is, for many, baseball is a religious experience. Field of Dreams is one of the most popular movies ever made about baseball, and I will say it's one of the most spiritual movies I have ever seen. It still makes me cry. Not exactly sure why. Rationally, I know that it's just a movie, and I understand how movies are made. I know how stories are structured, and I'm also aware of the elements in those stories that really pull at my heartstrings. But all the scientific rationality in the world does not keep me from weeping like a baby when I get to the end of that movie. When Kevin Costner's reunited with his dad, to me, it's mystic. A mystic religious experience because it's affirming and reminding me of something very basic and meaningful and essential. It's about the enduring mystery and magic of love itself. But then you may watch Field of Dreams and think it's just a dumb movie about baseball, and why is this guy over here crying his eyes out? Now, the book William James wrote accurately points out that there's a lot of variety in how we have mystical experiences, and subsequent scholars have also brought into that discussion how important it is to take into account things like our cultural influences, the point in time in which we live, our upbringing, and what we've learned about how the universe operates. All that's true. We're humans who live varied lives. We are born into a certain time, place, and family. And beyond that, we have successes and failures, good and bad things happen. We make great choices and really dumb ones. So we have to wonder, if Jane Stanford were alive today, would she be a spiritualist? And how would she describe that? And what movies would make her weep? And that brings me to our passage today from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Like a lot of what made it into the Bible, this is a piece of writing that is attempting to solve a problem. The problem is, Paul has a love-hate relationship with these people in Corinth. He spent a lot of time and energy among them, instructing this fledgling community on his vision, his particular vision of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So Paul's very fond of the Corinthians, and he's invested a great deal of himself in their success. Scholars think he probably wrote about 4 letters to this church, and this one he might have co-written with the apostle Timothy. But as it appears in the Bible, this letter may even be a combination of some of those other letters. But the bottom line is, the Corinthians, or at least some of them, have apparently decided that other traveling evangelists, who shall not be named by Paul, were more spiritually authentic than Paul. They believe Paul is basically a fraud and that what he's been teaching them is invalid. So, what we heard today is part of Paul's response to that. And the reason this letter is even in the Bible, I think, is because it speaks to the argument, the false argument, I'll say, that when it comes down to spirituality, that there can only be one valid kind of spiritual experience. In a broader and modern sense, it speaks to the false idea that one ever has to choose between being a spiritual religious person and a rational science-based person. So this passage begins with Paul describing in a really funny way, really, his own mystical experience. It's a pretty wild ride. Esther was asking me before the service, what is a third heaven? I don't know. But he talks about being taken up out of his body into paradise, but then he makes a rather stunning admission that he is imperfect, that he makes mistakes, that he is weak, that he suffers insults and injuries and has all sorts of problems, something he calls the thorn in the flesh. We still don't know what that means, but that he doesn't know it all. The thing is, Paul says, God's grace is sufficient for him, sufficient for him. In other words, as I read this, Paul is saying, I can tell you about my mystical experiences. I can tell you what I know, but I cannot claim to know everything. I'm only human. And being only human, I rely on the help of the holy. Paul is saying, I don't pretend to understand it completely, but I still rely on that grace to help me navigate life. So Paul knows what he knows, and he's willing to share that, but he also knows that there is a variety of spiritual experience. So it's foolish to think that anyone's personal spiritual experience is something that can be measured or that it's an indicator of how faithful they are or not. So if that's true, you might ask, if there's such great variety, if spirituality is so unique from one person to the next, and it's not something that can be quantified, then why do we even bother to come together and form churches and read from the same set of scriptures and sing the same songs and do more or less the same thing we do at church on big occasions like Christmas and Easter? Why not just stay home and have our own private spiritual experience or mystical experience? Well, to be honest, that's something I ask myself from time to time, but the answer, I think, is along the same lines as why, way back when I first watched the movie Field of Dreams in a movie theater that was packed with other people, I glanced around that room as the end credits rolled, and there were many tears flowing in addition to my own. Not everyone, of course, but for many, something happened in the viewing of that film that was a communal experience of reaching and expressing a truth that we shared, a bond that we shared. Now, I'm not suggesting that a movie is as significant as going to church, but although for some people it might be. I'm suggesting that the reason we gather together on Sundays and other times is mysterious. It's a holy mystery. Because there are many things that we seek answers for. There are aspects of life where we can rely on hard facts and scientific proof, but at the same time, there are experiences we seek and that we need and that we have when we're gathered together in a group and in a place and at a time when our hearts are reaching beyond what's known. When we acknowledge our fears and our frailties, our weaknesses and our faults and our imperfections, our humanness. And we know that we're not alone in that. And we know and we hope somehow that beyond our human limits, that there is sufficient grace to see us through to the next day and to the next day. that there is love living within and among and beyond us. And that love, we believe, is not just for receiving. That love is meant for giving away through our hands and our hearts and our voices. This past Tuesday, I was involved in a kind of mystical, spiritual experience as about 20 of us loaded up, as Pete said, 10 SUVs and one pickup truck with a month's worth of food that we had collected as a church. We drove over to the CSA distribution center and unloaded it, had it weighed. Helping and watching that happen, it was crystal clear to me that this was a mystical, spiritual experience. Now, there were no weird visions going on, at least that I was aware of. And none of us that I saw had an ecstatic religious reaction. I don't know, maybe Pete did. It was all really matter of fact. We delivered food and it felt good, but that did not make it any less of a spiritual and even mystical experience, because that food we collected during the month of June and that we delivered to CSA to be distributed and shared with people in need are people whom we may not know personally, but they are people with whom we are connected because they are inherently valuable and worthy and just as loved by God as anyone. And we did all that, not to pat ourselves on the back for being do-gooders, but because we're compelled by our faith and by our hearts and by our good sense that tells us that doing good things for others is ultimately what we are put here on earth to do. And that, my friends, is precisely what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves, to put our beliefs into action, to pursue the teachings and the example of Jesus, to do good for the sake of doing good. And that is the highest spiritual, mystical experience of all. Here together, we know that. We honor that. We give thanks for that. We experience that. And if we're bold enough, we're moved to share that mystical spiritual experience with those we know and those we don't yet know who need and want to join us in our cause. Amen.